The American Revolution, in other words, is never finished. It must always be renewed.
Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend.
What if it's not envy?
We must take back our cities, and take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Auron. Glad to have you here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You have an Auron Macintyre show, right? Who are you again? Why don't you fill us in?
In case nobody knows.
Why are you here?
Yeah.
I've run a show over on The Blaze, the Auron Macintyre Show. It's on all the podcast platforms, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and Blaze TV. Obviously, I've also got a column over at The Blaze that you can check out, Substack, and the book that I think we're going to be touching on, The Total State.
Yeah,
Right
The
over
Total
here.
State.
Yeah.
This is such a good book because I think a lot of us have gone through this this long journey, right, away from liberalism, under whatever name you want to call it. And there's a lot of things that are entailed by liberalism. You could include universalism and just sort of the blueprint approach to politics rather than the realist approach to politics. And what that came out with, from your perspective and our perspective as well, is in the name of freedom, we wound up with this sort of entrenched bureaucratic totalitarianism, but all of it was done in the name of human rights and democracy and popular sovereignty and all the things that we grew up with. And I think people have a hard time wrapping their head around this, that it was actually the rhetorical universe of freedom that actually wound up causing our bureaucratic managerialism, that you kind of get into detail about how that works. I mean, would you say that's a fair assessment of what's going on? There's this massive chasm between the rhetorical myths that operate in people's minds, and we basically live under the thumb of the largest, most totalizing state in world history. And can you make sense of that for us? Like, we tell ourselves it's all about freedom, that's what America's for, and yet on the other side of the scale, there's actually no aspect of our life that's free anymore. Can you kind of put that together for us?
Sure. Interesting thing when writing this book was I was, like, as you pointed out, a lot of us are on this journey. And so I don't think that the book necessarily is one singular thing so much as the experience that a lot of people have had as they've looked at the experiences over the last few years when it came to COVID, lockdowns, other excesses of the government that we've seen, the failures of these major institutions. And we talk about the land of the free, the home of the brave. We are the most free people in human history. America is all about freedom, freedom, freedom. And yet we live in a state where people can shut down your church, shut down your business, lock you in your house, try to force you to take an experimental vaccine. And these two things can't possibly be true simultaneously. And I think, ultimately, the book looks at new causes, but also old truths that we have both, I think, found, that all of us talking here have discovered, that there's simultaneously a certain aspect of modernity that drives us towards these giant bureaucracies that consume many of our freedoms, but also some of the most ancient lessons throughout philosophy, religion, sociology, history, which is that people who abandon virtue lose their true freedom, their true liberty, really, I think is the appropriate word. Over time, we have watched the state step in. It now educates our children, takes care of our parents, makes sure that our destitute niece doesn't go homeless. It does all these things that we used to have to do, that were big parts of the intermediate institutions that we evolved ourselves in: the church, the family, the tribe, the fraternal organization. These things that really tied America together in what Alexis de Tocqueville called the intermediate institutions that stood between us and government. And Alexis de Tocqueville gets quoted all the time by conservatives saying, oh, well, it's these intermediate institutions that keep the government in check, that keep the government from growing and becoming totalitarian. And of course, that's true. But what they don't read is the next part of that same chapter where de Tocqueville talks about those institutions and says, and the reason that these institutions are so important is that it solves America's individualism problem. He
Yeah.
looked at America and he said, actually, one of the things that the upsides and the downsides of America is it's very individualistic. So people will look to set out to solve problems. But the good thing about America is that they solve these problems by forming voluntary associations. But if at any point they stop forming these involuntary associations, then the individualism aspect will eventually cause very, very serious issues in the United States. And that's what we're seeing now. We said we thought we were becoming freer because we allowed the government to do all these things for us. I don't have to take care of these extended relatives. I don't have to take care of my neighbor. I don't have to take care of my community. But what we ended up doing is giving government more and more power every time we did that. So the state became more total as we became more liberated from our social institutions, our social responsibilities. And so, again, there's new technology that enables this. There's, I think, political science that's relatively unexplored that helps us to better understand this phenomenon. So that's kind of the new part of the book. But the most ancient part of the book is the stuff that Aristotle told us, that ultimately virtue is about acting in communities and taking responsibility for ourselves. That's ultimately what restrains the power of government, not something we wrote down on paper.
That phrase "total state" that you used for the book title, that comes from somewhere specific. I mean, you talked about like new contours of exploration in political science, but that phrase itself comes from Carl Schmitt. So let's start with Carl Schmitt. Like I think nobody's allowed to talk about Carl Schmitt, but he is the thinker of the age.
Yeah.
He is the one that critiqued the 20th century and where it was all going. So what lessons do you draw from him, and why do you use him as, for the title of your book?
Yeah, Schmitt is obviously very important. I actually spend a lot more time on people like Bertrand de Juvenal, but they're like, moderate classical liberals, so they're not as controversial. No one cares about the fact that I draw most of my stuff from non-controversial people. It's much spicier to talk about Carl Schmitt. But Carl Schmitt is still critical. You're right to point this out. And really, Schmitt's point when he coined the phrase "the total state" was that once democracy, once the political pierced every aspect of society. At some point, politics was over here, and it affected, of course, lots of things. But the idea that every aspect of life would be oriented towards acquiring and wielding political power was not really a thing through most of history. But as popular sovereignty, as the will of the people became the mechanism by which we validated state power, it became more and more important to gather that will, to secure that will, to make sure that it was always working in the manner that you wish, which meant that the democratic process, the political process, needed to be involved in every aspect of society. And so once the personal and political breached each other, once the constant need to control political opinion, to control public understanding, breached into homes, families, communities, churches, every aspect of life, dating, it doesn't matter. Everything is about your politics. Everything is about, do you have the correct opinions? Are you ideologically aligned? Are you pushing the current narrative? That's all that matters. Once that permeated every aspect of society, we get the total state, because when the state's power rests on its ability to manipulate public opinion, well, public opinion is forged at every level of society. It's forged pre-politically even. So we need to eliminate the pre-political in things like the family so that the political can completely permeate, can completely be controlled by the state. And so the total state is the one in which the state recognizes its need to reach into every single social interaction, every job hiring, every firing, every marriage, every childbirth, every educational institution. That's what creates the total state.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, you mentioned Schmitt, and you mentioned I think you have Sam Francis in there and some others. I mean, why don't people recognize them as like legitimate thinkers that have contributed to describing our problem? Like, the people that you get into Burnham and you get into others, these people have been neglected. Why do you think that is? And why do you think so many younger people, like all three of us, are excited to explore these untapped areas? Like, why do they speak so well to our current age?
Well, again, it really just depends on which of the thinkers you're talking about. If we're talking about someone like Schmidt, obviously his association with the National Socialist Party makes him very taboo, even though the left has been reading him for actually quite a long time. And he's been acknowledged as someone who's critical in jurisprudence, despite his political affiliations at a particular time in history. We also have guys like Sam Francis. He is someone who ended up having controversial views on race, and so therefore he's inadmissible in many of these discussions. Guys like Burnham were founding the National Review. This is a guy who's a
Mhm.
CIA asset. I mean, he should be relatively discussable. I mean, if Buckley
Yeah.
is, then you would think that Burnham would
Mhm.
also be someone that you can reference, and yet we see that he is often pushed aside. I think for the most part because his analysis is lays things too bare. They're too obvious. They're too honest. I've had the ability now to discuss with several people who've written for the National Review about James Burnham, and for the most part, most of them just didn't know much about him. There's
Yeah.
just a lacuna in the knowledge, even of people who are professional or working at the organization he helped to found. Just they're very unfamiliar. The same thing when I interacted with conservative intellectuals when it came to political science. Very few of them were read on Burnham. The managerial elite, they had very little familiarity. It's a lot of de Tocqueville. And look, I just quoted de Tocqueville. I like de Tocqueville, but like political science, there's more. Like it's not the only
Yeah.
conservative outlook you can have. Someone like Joseph de Maistre, another French
Mhm.
author who I think had very deep insights about the American experience, but is somebody who's counted more as a reactionary. This guy is a devoted Catholic and a monarchist, and so perhaps doesn't work into the normal avenues of American political thought. I think we've seen a lot of guys, even someone like Russell Kirk, who is really, he literally wrote the book on conservative thought. But even he has been pushed to the side for the most
Yeah.
part. You still have guys like Ben
Mhm.
Shapiro being like, yeah, Russell Kirk, yeah, he's probably got something valuable to say. But they never reference him. They actually never actually bring forward any of his ideas. We kind of always just get this really, really strange Reaganite snapshot of a civics class from the 1980s, and that is pretty much the only level of thought we get from the vast majority of political punditry.
I think the reason people don't refer to like Russell Kirk or James Burnham is because one thing that they have in common, and they are actually worlds apart in a lot of their instincts and in all the cultural instincts and things like that. But one of the reasons people don't quote them a lot, we don't hear a lot about them, is because they were much more particularistic, right? They didn't adhere to this universalist mythos that the post-war consensus really needs in order to justify its actions, especially in the 80s and the 90s. Like Reaganism, if anything, is a universalist approach to politics where there's these natural rights that exist for all time and they are not distinct to any particular peopled community with a heritage, but they actually are transcendent over those things. And Burnham rejects that view. I mean, he's very much a situationalist in terms of his politics, and Russell Kirk is much more of a patrimonialist, if you could say it that way. So these are approaches that basically are outside the purview of what the post-war consensus needed to push its paradigm into the Western Hemisphere after World War II. So that's kind of what I would say to that. It's like it's not just the controversial things like Sam Francis and Carl Schmitt, but it's also you can't operate a universalist empire, an ideological empire, if a lot of the components of your civil society, like Russell Kirk would put forth, are grounded in a unique peopled experience.
Yeah, I want to be clear because it's become somewhat fashionable at this point in our circles to kind of like reconstruct the Reagan presidency to dunk on it pretty handily. And I do think that there's some value in um, you know returning Reagan back to humanity. Maybe he doesn't need to be
Yeah.
deified. Perhaps Caesar is not actually divine in this case. However, I do think people are a little hard on Reagan only because we have to recognize the geopolitical situation that we were in, whether people want to recognize this or not. We were in an arms race with a global power that could wipe out all of humanity. Really glad that didn't happen, but that's a existential struggle that we just kind of pretend didn't happen the minute we're not
Mhm.
subject to it. Like people really were drilling and hiding under desks in case they ended up getting, obliterated by a bomb. Like these were real concerns that people had. And how do you defeat a giant globalistic ideology that's conquering large chunks of Europe and Asia? You come up with your own giant global ideology, right? Like you need
Yeah.
this narrative of the free West against, the despotic Soviet Union. And of course, comparatively, the West was freer and the Soviet Union was despotic. So I think we should recognize that what we ended up in was a real, true mimetic war, like a war of ideologies that was incredibly powerful, that literally had the entire globe threatened. We could have all died pretty easily if a few things had gone wrong without God's providence, protecting us. And so ultimately, while I think that a lot of damage came out of many of the globalizing aspects of the Reagan presidency that you're discussing, ultimately this was a man of his time and in his place trying to solve a problem that none of us will ever need to solve. Right? We'll never face that kind of existential threat from an empire that literally could wipe humanity off the face of the earth. So recognizing that perhaps that was necessary, or perhaps it seemed necessary at the time. It seemed like the only way, in the same way that Nixon opening China, putting daylight between China and the Soviet Union, ultimately probably saved certain amount of geopolitical disaster, even though ultimately we are now paying the price for that, right? With China and its rise and the trade problems we have with China. So it's a very complicated situation in a giant world of high stakes geopolitics. But ultimately, whether it was the right move or the wrong move, you're correct that the aftermath of the globalization of that movement still sits at the heart of much of what is considered mainstream conservatism, which is itself, whether it recognizes it or not, a globalistic ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Since you brought it up, I have to comment. Sometimes I'll have people be like, well, why do you have this, Nixon poster, up there? Don't you know he's responsible for opening up China and all of the all the problems with that and what we're suffering now. I mean, you even mentioned it in your book when you're talking about 2020 and the supply chain and the virus comes out of China, and then everything everything we need, all the medical supplies and pharmaceuticals and everything are made there, and we're stuck, right? And that lesson was not clearly learned. But like you said, you're in the context of this truly existential struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and had that not been done, if Nixon had not gone to China, right, the Soviet Union would have won, right? Like that's just the reality. Like we wouldn't even be talking about Reagan and how wonderful or conservatives wouldn't be talking, for the last 40 years about how wonderful Ronald Reagan is and how great he is, because like we just would have lost. And so we need to have monuments to Ronald Reagan in DC, or rather to Richard Nixon in DC, a giant statue. Maybe replace the Lincoln Memorial with Nixon. I don't know. It's a suggestion. But Auron, I think something that your book does is puts into words the things that many of the conclusions that people our age and especially younger have realized, because you listen to conservative pundits, you read conservative writers for our entire lifetimes, and it's always, we just need to get back to the Constitution. Right? We just need to have the Constitution again, and this veneration for the Constitution, as if it's still in existence, right? As if the constitutional order of 1787 or even the constitutional order of 1865 is still extant. And people our age realize like that just simply is not true. I mean, I think for me, the first moment I like truly realized this was when the like Obamacare, it it's clearly like just patently unconstitutional to have an appropriations bill originate in the United States Senate, which is what Obamacare was. And it should have just been immediately struck down by the Supreme Court. And it, of course, wasn't, right? Because it's very politically popular. And so this illusion of, oh, we still have a constitution, like, was just immediately shattered for me. And then you see everything else that has occurred since then. You look into the things that have occurred in the decades that preceded that, and it's like, no, this has been gone for a very long time. And you see it like CJ talks about Garrett Garrett and the revolution within the forms, right? So the facade of constitutional order, the facade of a democratic republic is still there, but behind the scenes, the entire edifice has been reconstructed and just simply no longer exists whatsoever. And the hard thing is, right, when we make that argument, or you make that argument, or guys like us make that argument, you have all of these people, I'll name him, like James Lindsay, for example, that are like, you guys are woke, right? You're trying to subvert the Constitution. You're trying to tear down our constitutional order. These guys are bad. They hate America. They hate the Constitution. And it's like, no, I actually don't. I love our country deeply. I actually love our country way more than you do, James Lindsay. I love the Constitution way more than you do, James Lindsay. And I love it so much, I'm not going to play Weekend at Bernie's with it anymore. Right. You just have this dead corpse that you're pretending is still alive. And I'm not going to play those games. I'm not going to pretend the emperor has clothes when he clearly does not. And so, I mean, there's a question here, actually. Do you think,
Questions behind the paywall.
That's right.
After the pre-session.
Yeah, we're 23 minutes in. We're maybe
The
past
first
the
half
paywall
of the interview is just me listening.
me talking.
Yes,
That's
wise.
right. But the question here is, right? Do you see the coming generation of young politically aware men? Do you see them as mostly fully conscious of this reality and beginning to act politically within that context, right? Do you see that happening? And so and if so, right, what is that going to look like over the next 20 or 30 years?
So I would say that guys like James are progressives, and they're progressive in the sense that they think, in many ways, but particularly in the sense that they think that the Constitution is just a piece of political technology. Like, the founders got together and they worked in a lab and they tinkered with the laws of physics until they created the government machine. And the government machine has certain rules. And as long as you follow the rules of the government machine produces kind of objective good governance, right? Like that's the way that they've treated the Constitution. And to be fair to James, his belief is shared by a large amount of conservatives. A large number of conservatives, myself included, came up with this idea that the Constitution is just this advancement in governance. And once we kind of made this advancement, it's like developing electricity. Now, just this is the way the world works now. The homes will be powered because we have the electricity. The government will work because we have the Constitution. Of course, if you look at what our founders said about the Constitution, that's just not true. If you look specifically, every conservative loves to quote John Adams, right? This Constitution is made for a moral and religious people. It doesn't work for any other. And we love to quote it because it's true. And it recognizes the importance of virtue and Christianity behind the Constitution. But for guys like James, that's really not important, right? Like the Constitution
Clearly.
is a piece of technology, right? It's a piece of technology. It's not the product of a line of tradition, of moral thought. It's not deeply ensconced in a culture and a people. But for, I think, a lot of new up-and-coming conservatives, they're recognizing the problem with this, right? They've been through too many of these situations where just pointing to the words on the paper didn't stop the government. The government still locked them in their homes. The government still took them out of school. The government still closed their churches. The government still wielded the power of censorship. The government was not stopped by the Constitution. It's not because there's something wrong with the Constitution. It's because the Constitution, only works when it's animated by the belief, tradition, the moral vision of the people who wrote it, the people who are supposed
Yeah.
to live it. And so, if you just have this progressive view of the Constitution, that because we created this piece of political technology, we set up the government machine, and the government machine works, and all we have to do is have faith in the government machine, then you've completely missed everything the founders told you about the Constitution. You're explicitly ignoring what the people who wrote the Constitution believed about it. And you're also ignoring just your eyeballs, like just the actual observable truth about the world around you. As where I think young guys coming up are like recognizing, okay, I do believe in many of these principles, but I believe in these principles because they are part of my heritage. They are part of my faith. They are part of my tradition. They are grounded in something. There is a union between the Protestant Christian understanding of governance and kind of the Anglo sensibility when it comes to law and order that brings itself together in the American Constitution. And there are other people who don't have those backgrounds who are capable of living under that rubric, but this is the core. This is the foundation of where that belief comes from. The Constitution only works if it's animated by that belief, not because we set it up as some kind of clockwork government that runs in perpetuity.
Let me ask you about politics and the politicization of society. A lot of conservatives, constitutionalists, libertarians, they will respond to the fact that everything's been politicized. You can't buy a stuffed animal at a store or participate in a little league game without some aspect of it being political. They respond to this by encouraging their neighbors. And these are good people. These are just everyday people. But the response is always, we need to get out of politics and depoliticize and stop thinking in terms of like what we can do within the parameters of government action. And they have this response to the politicization of society where they basically just want to exit, right? Mm-hmm. They just want this massive exodus. And they say, look, the government shouldn't be doing all these things. Therefore, we should just ignore it all and live our own lives. While the left, they double down in the face of that and they capture even more ground. And so even though we live in a society that's been completely politicized, I don't think the answer is to voluntarily, as the right, depoliticize ourselves. Can you maybe interact with that theme a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, they're coming from a very classic American tradition, right? Which is when in doubt, exit, right? We did it to start the United States. We've, fled England to start the United States. We exited there rather than fight. Then when we got to the United States, people who didn't like what were happening in New England spread further west, right? Like they just kept exiting and exiting. The frontier was always there for us. Right. And so the American response to political disunion has always been exit. And it worked for the most part because we had pretty much infinite space and we had a federal system and just the inability to exert this kind of universal political ideology across the entire continent. So the way that governance ran in Texas or in Arkansas or in Maine or in California or in Georgia just looked radically different from each other. And that was okay because the government couldn't force this unified aspect onto every piece of civilization. And so the impulse to exit is a relatively healthy one that worked for a very long time. But we're at a frontier. And the government isn't going to leave you alone. Like we got the railway, we got the telegraph, we got the internet. No matter how you feel about that, that's the reality. And the government can now reach across the entire continent and touch you at a moment's notice. So the idea that the government is just going to leave you to its own devices is a misunderstanding. Again, I like the federal system, but we have to understand the nature of power. As soon as the power exists, it will be used. I prefer it didn't exist, especially at this scale, but since it's here, it will be used. And since it's going to be used, you can't unilaterally depoliticize. I agree. I think ultimately it would be great if we could have a mass depoliticization of our society, but that only works in one of two ways. One, we remove the political question off the table entirely, i.e. people just don't vote. They don't have a franchise. They don't have a constant interaction with the way that the government runs, so they don't have to be obsessed every moment and they don't have to be brainwashed every moment by the governing elites. Or we need general consensus. We need ideological consensus. That's the other way you remove political problems. You either have a removal of the political, or you have unity of belief, which is what the left realizes, and that's what it's trying to force all the time, is this constant unification of belief. Now, what a lot of people are doing, I know you guys are involved in this, is, they're doing the great sort, right? They're involved in moving with people, in vicinity of people, building communities with people who believe like they do. They can share communities, they can share that understanding, they can share that moral vision. The way that communities have existed basically in the entirety of human existence. And so I think that that's really the options available to us. The idea that you can just unilaterally remove yourself from politics and that will solve the problem clearly isn't true. Like, we've watched these people try to castrate your children. Gavin Newsom is talking about women and children's sports while literally running a state which will steal your children and castrate them, like, against your will. Like, this is the government we have right now. And so we can't sit around and pretend like it's not. Like, oh, well, totalitarianism is around the corner. No, you've seen it. Like, it may not be there all the time. They may not be gulagging you every moment, but it's sitting under the surface. And if you just sit there and pretend it's not happening and you just try to depoliticize, then you're just going to be a victim. There's clearly no other way to understand that scenario.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, you have to see the cycle go all the way through, right? In order to depoliticize, you first have to become increasingly and perhaps outrageously political until the enemy has been confronted and undermined such that it won't take things in its own direction, right? In order to depoliticize, we first have to be political. We have to be willing to engage in politics in its most realist framework possible. I mean, that seems increasingly the way. And like, so many like Ron Paul libertarians have been, and I was one of them, were very defeated, from the years 2008, to 2020. And even in the first administration of Donald Trump, it was increasingly obvious that like federal action seemed just completely nonsensical and useless. And one of the things we've seen in the last 100 days is that no, actually, there is something that can be done and should be done in politics, because if power is at the center and power is being wielded against you, then it's only there on that theater, on that stage, that you can confront the enemy. And so it's a very good reminder that we actually do have the obligation and duty to our ancestors and to to those who come after us to be politically involved.
Yeah, I think also, it's something that you bring up in the book and explain really well is what liberalism actually is, and why this phenomenon, especially among conservatives, happens, is that liberalism has removed the political from public life, right? So all of the existential political struggles, the questions, the conflict between friend and enemy, and even the very distinction between friend and enemy, that's all pushed to the side. Those things are gone, right? We don't have to worry about any of that anymore. So now we can just worry about producing a very efficient society that just GDP maxes all day long. And that's the only question we have is, right, are we going to produce more stuff than we produced last year? Are we going to have more wealth? Are we going to have better lives? Is our cost of living going to be commensurate with the increase in production? And will our lifespans continue to get longer and things like that, rather than dealing with what human society has always dealt with, right? The political conflict between groups. And the left never fully abandoned those things. And so they still operate in political terms, while the right is
So-called right.
the so-called right. I mean, the right really is illegal in America today. But what remnant of the right there is, and certainly among the population, it's large, right? There is a silent majority that's getting smaller and smaller, but it's still out there. And we saw that in November, that it's still out there. It has been pacified into believing that political struggle is over. I mean, I remember growing up, in even in discussing politics, is like, well, we're all Americans, right? Whether you're Democrat or Republican, we're all united and together and on the same team, right? And I think that really typifies what liberalism was, right? They say that to us, and we believed it. Meanwhile, they are marching through the institutions, taking everything over, and politicizing every aspect of life, and it seems that jig is up, right? That those days are over. I think your book elucidates this, that young people that are on the right no longer no longer buy that liberalism, the way it has been for the last 100 years, is basically over, and that we have to re-engage in the political, that we have to understand that we are in a conflict of friend and enemy. Like, when you get to the point where these people are locking you in your home, forcing you to wear a diaper on your face, taking your children away and castrating them, right? You're like, friend and enemy distinctions back on the table at that point,
Yeah.
right? And you need to operate in that way. Like, if they're putting up rainbow flags on your main street, right? All right, now you have enemies, right? You have enemies that want you destroyed, that want your way of life eradicated, right? When they're tearing down your statues of your heroes, they want that. They're doing that because symbolically they're saying they want you dead. They want your past dead. They want any remnant of that erased completely. And people see this with their own eyes. Oh, I actually have enemies. I really do. I have enemies that want to destroy me, and I need to confront them as such. And so, I mean, you get into this in the end of the book, that the total state is coming to an end, right? That it cannot sustain itself forever. And we can get into that, as we go on here, but and you can already start to see some of those fractures, developing. That I mean, just even looking at the Biden administration, now that it's over, most people have already tried to forget it, but it really does show the fault lines in the total state, that they don't have any. It's not just that they won't promote anyone that's competent to run anything. It's they don't have them. They're unable to. Right. They're unable to bring anyone in that has any semblance of competency. And so, I do wonder, because things could go in so many different directions, right? Maybe Trump is successful in these 4 years, and he fixes many of our problems, even more than maybe we here suspect that he'll be able to. And so you can take an optimistic outlook that things could be really good, and he could solve all sorts of problems, and bring the power of the state, rein it in to a certain extent, but then, right, it's still there, and it's actually even stronger when he's all done. Or it could go much more like his first term, and the obstruction reaches a zenith, and it continues chugging along and hastening its own destruction. So how do you think things will go? I mean, ultimately, like you've written in the book, that you think that it will collapse under its own weight, very gradually, which I tend to agree with. But like, what are ways in which that would happen, right? So in 2035, right, what do you think things will look like in terms of the total state?
Well, there's nothing more dangerous than making predictions, which is also what I say in the book, right? Nothing that will make you look more foolish.
So be general.
Right. I'll say this, all the points that you made about the total state, that liberalism's attempt to remove the existential, are really becoming evident, right? Like we for a very long time recognized the dangers of the deepest passions of mankind, right? And you can understand, after all the wars of religion and everything else that had, the conflagrations of Europe, how it was easy to sell this idea that we would remove as many of these as possible and kind of set up this minimum
Mhm.
viable morality. The Enlightenment and its project of nations afterward were certainly part of that. And then when that proved insufficient, and we still had 2 world wars, despite the fact that we had removed so many of those passions, we decided to do even more, right? Like, well, now forget just religion. We're going to crush nationhood out of people. Like the idea that you even have anything shared, that you even have
Mhm.
a shared group or any shared interest. We'll eliminate all of these things. Right, like that's been the effort, is just to abstract more and more and more, remove more and more identity, dial back the existential more and more. But as you pointed out, those things continue to operate below the surface, and this came to a head in things like COVID, where we recognize that these objective institutions actually aren't objective at all, and this game that we were told is over has actually been played behind our backs the entire time. And the
Mhm.
problem is that the total state is going to continue, but it's lost that cover, right? Like there's no, it's very difficult for most people to go back. You can see the panic in kind of the establishment conservative
Mhm.
people, right? That's why there are so many people screaming about this. That's why you get kind of the James Lindsays and the Vocal Distances and the Joel Barrys. They're like, no, 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 no. We go back to the time where like we didn't acknowledge the game was being played. Yeah, okay, maybe the game is still being played, but we can figure out how to make it neutral this time, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work. And so that anyone who's watched this, anyone who is not deeply invested in that narrative, and most young people are less invested in it, recognize the reality. They're not as tied to this idea that we have to get back to something they've never seen, that they've never observed,
Mhm.
that they don't think has ever existed.
And led us
And
to this point. Yeah. Yeah.
right, and on top of that, the fact that logistical abilities break down,
Mhm.
we're seeing the reemergence of even more tribal identities in places like the Middle East. The idea that like dictators could hold entire disparate groups together and form them into like modern liberal states, like that
Mhm.
delusion is breaking down in the foreign
Mhm.
policy aspect. The idea that we can just offshore every aspect of our economy safely is being shattered by the fact that we have conflicts with China, we have conflicts with Russia. Many of the key producers of our manufactured products, our medicines, providers of natural resources, they are hostile to us. Like you can't operate a liberal global empire when so many of these actors are outside of your control. It's just becoming very clear that the building blocks of the type of society that we created simply are unsustainable. And that's not something I'm celebrating. It's just the
Yeah.
truth, right? And so can Trump fix a lot of this? He can certainly cut a lot of the degradation out, right? He can
Mhm.
reform these institutions, he can cut out a lot of the rot. But ultimately there are structural issues involved here, right? Like and Trump
Mhm.
recognizes that. He knows that no matter how many times you rearrange the GDP or the economic numbers, moving all our manufacturing to other countries is stupid, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just stupid. It makes you vulnerable. You're not producing anything. You can dance all the numbers you want in front of people. If your country produces nothing, if all the jobs are like financial derivative or whatever, then there's you don't have a real country, and you're vulnerable to every other nation because you're entirely dependent on them for your sustainability. Trump recognizes
Mhm.
this when it comes to all kinds of stuff, immigration. So can he address a lot of those problems? Yes. But
Mhm.
ultimately, there are still the underlying issues of scale. There are still, and very importantly, the underlying issues of virtue and community. And so, what I've always said, and what I said in the book, and what I'll continue to say, is if you get a guy like Trump, and when I wrote the book, I didn't know whether we'd have Trump or not. But if you get a
Mhm.
guy like Trump, you should treat it as a reprieve, right? A
Yeah.
moment of, oh, I can build now. I can do the things. I don't have to worry about going to jail if I start some kind of like community. I don't have to worry about the FBI coming and Wacoing a bunch of people who just want to be able to pray together, right? Like I don't have to
Yeah.
worry about the FBI spying on my church, right? Like it
Yeah.
gives you breathing room. I can go and fix something at my local school board without the FBI declaring me an enemy of the state, right? Like these are
Yeah.
all real things that happened in the United States in the last 4 years. We joke about them, but they are 100% real. This is the real
Mhm.
totalitarianism that existed in the United States. It's not illusion. We're not being hyperbolic. Like these are real. The secret police went out and hunted down parents for disagreeing with the school board about castrating their children. That's a real thing that happened in the United States. And so we can take this time and go and fix all of this when we know the government will not be hostile to us. But if we're sitting around and just waiting for Trump to like wave his magic wand and fix all of these problems for us, then we have woefully misunderstood the moment. I am rooting for Trump. I am optimistic about Trump. I'm optimistic about the things he can fix. But I know for a fact he cannot fix it all. We got to take responsibility. It's incumbent on us, and we have to start in the communities, in the localities.
One of the hardest things about communicating with normies is just the fact that, you know, we operate, we approach and interpret politics in ways completely at odds with the way that we're supposed to, right? So we don't frame our arguments in a way that they can really identify with. Do you have any like suggestions about how to communicate? I mean, people on the right know you as someone that has a very good track record of communicating complex themes to, you know, very basic crowd normies. I mean, like what things work for you? I mean, do things like freedom and liberty, that kind of framing, should we stick to those things? Should we emphasize heritage and patrimony? Like where do you think our approach should be sort of in terms of like spreading the message?
So the great news is this is way, way easier than people make it out to be. Like people are just like, this is this insurmountable divide. The normie can't understand. They don't understand. I am the true rebel. No, man, it's really not. It's really not that hard. So the first thing you just got to do is you got to take that like, I'm punk rock mentality. I'm dangerous. Just throw it out the window, man.
Yeah.
Like just throw it out the window. Okay. You are a sensible centrist. You are saying what your grandparents believed, what the Bible believes, what the founding fathers believe. You are standing on the shoulders of giants of history. You are standing with eternal truth behind you. You are not edgy boy. Okay. That just get rid of it. Get rid of that identity. You do not need to be the edgy boy. Okay. And when you walk up to so many people who are normies, when you talk to them about this stuff, what you quickly realize, if you're paying attention, is they want to believe you.
Yeah.
They want it. Like they know these problems exist. They can feel these problems behind every conversation they've ever had. But they have existed in a structure that is entirely rhetorically meant to guide them to basically dead ends, right? Like I'm supposed to care about community, but I also have to let free trade destroy every job in my community. The normie knows this is wrong. Like and Donald Trump just saying this, like just the basic thing of I'm going to protect your jobs, and I don't care what some random institute in DC says about it. I don't care what Cato says about it. Like him just being willing to say that won him the loyalty of most boomers, right? They love Trump. They can't get enough of him. Why? Because he just said things they already believed. It's okay to close the border. It's okay to tell people they can't be here. They already knew that. They already believed that. They just wanted somebody to tell them. Okay. They just wanted Mitt Romney to shut up and have somebody else tell them the truth. Right. That's why they're willing to lay in traffic for this man, just because he said a few true things. Okay. All his other flaws, but he just said some true things they wanted to hear. So when you're talking to people, okay, just don't try to be the edgy boy. Don't try to get out there and give them your most divisive take. Ooh, the Constitution's dead. Okay, but it's valuable. We love it. It has principles that we're tied to. We're more loyal to its tradition than the people who are pretending the facsimile that they're flogging is still alive. We're simply saying obvious truths. That doesn't mean we don't value these things. If you come to a normal, like boomer conservative and you say, you know what I care about? I care about Christ. I care about the ability of the people around me to form families and have strong communities that raise children. I believe in making sure that my friends and family have jobs that they can use to support themselves, and that we build networks that allow us to take care of each other. I think that ultimately our communities do this job better than the government does, and that we need to get the government out of a large number of these decisions, even more decisions than you might be comfortable with, even the decisions of who we associate with, where we spend time, how we build our businesses. I am more conservative than you. I am not
Right.
less conservative. I'm not throwing away these values. I'm asking you
Mhm.
to be true to the things that you say you value. You say you value family. You say you value the church. You say you want God back in the schools or back in. Okay, great. Then let's really do it. Let's
Yeah.
really do it. Not play by the rules the Democrats tell us exist. Not play by the rules that the universities tell us exist. Not play by the rules that the TV tells us. But if we really want these things, let's act like it and take action towards it rather than twiddling your thumbs. I think if you bring that to most normies, they're like, yeah, actually that sounds pretty good. Right? It might take them a few times. We might have to hear that a few times. We've all been in that scenario where you have the first conversation, you have the second conversation. By the time you have the fourth conversation, they're telling it back to you, right? Like we've all been in
Mhm.
that scenario.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's real. Like I don't think this is it's hard in a mass communication, right? That's why,
Yeah.
that is a skill, but one-on-one, you can have this conversation with anybody. And if you're honest and just open, I think it's actually a lot easier than people think.
Yeah. It's funny because we've talked about the fact that all the different institutions, all the religious entities and nonprofit entities and for-profit entities, they're all swimming left at all times, right? Like
Mhm.
every you can look back 40, 50 years and you can recognize the fact that things are always just teetering toward the left. Now, in the midst of that, the post-war consensus, the center, it's basically falling apart. The regime narrative that constructed the world of the 1990s is done for. And we recognize that a lot of people are realizing that there is actually a real right wing that can be useful in the midst of this faltering. But do you think that the left is just exhausted and tired, or do you think that they too can become more radical? And do you think the future of politics, at least in the near term, is very bifurcated? And there actually going to be a series of tensions and confrontations between right and left, or do you think the entire left train is exhausted and out of steam?
Yeah, I got to say, if there's one thing I got wrong, it was that the passion of the left would continue apace.
Mm.
I was very sure that they would attempt violence. I mean, we saw what happened with the riots, the Summer of Love, all that stuff. I was very sure that would continue if Trump got reelected. And what we discovered is actually the left blew its back out, man. Like they
Yeah.
actually just they put it all on the line. It turns out that they did not have the capacity for violence that they summoned in 2020. There was an extra layer of kind of racial grievance that they needed to ignite that passion that simply did not exist this time around. And that ultimately, after screaming, fascist, fascist, fascist this whole time, they were completely unable to ideologically just basically deny an election and take police action to punish their enemies, because that was really the only option they had on the table. Trump
Yeah.
won with a mandate. He didn't win by just barely eking out an electoral college win. Like
Mhm.
he gained significant support in demographics he was never supposed to. Even a lot of people on the right, like myself, were skeptical that we would see that shift in demographics. It's still not totally what he would need to win those groups, but it's meaningful. The
Mm.
fact that you just saw that really took a lot of the wind out of the sails of the Democrats. And so what we're seeing right now is the Democrats are very much in the wilderness right now. Both sides
Mhm.
are doing this. The right is having its coalition shootouts, and the left are having their coalition shootouts. But it's always better to do it from power, right? Like it's
Yeah.
always better to be the one in
Yeah.
power deciding how much of this whole thing you're going to get to drive, rather than being on the outside. And the left really recognizes that they rhetorically, threw everything against the wall, and the sacred democracy that they said they were defending returned them Donald Trump. Right? When no matter how many times they scream Nazi or fascist, it turns out that actually America just wants whatever they're calling that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so now they have to deal with that fact. A lot of them are trying to pivot, right? We're seeing like the Gavin Newsom rebrand.
Mhm.
I'm hip, I'm with it. I got the podcast, kids. I can do the Joe Rogans. I'm going to talk to Charlie Kirk. Isn't he radical? Isn't he crazy? Let's see if we can, have a
Let me
conversation.
or let me I actually had another question, but just real quick off the cuff, do you think that was good or bad of Charlie Kirk to do that?
Um, you know, I would not have done that, but
Yeah.
I understand why Kirk did it. right?
Mhm.
If I was sitting in the room, I would be like, no, I would not give Newsom the time of day. You're ascendant. There is zero reason to be in conversation with this guy. That said, I don't think it's a detriment. I don't think it hurt Kirk or anything. I think ultimately, it just shows how desperate the left is, and the fact that Newsom, took a lot of fire for that, and most of it was, we don't need to hear from white guys about where the left is, just further drives that wedge, right? In a lot of ways, it just
Mhm.
continues. The woke and the mainstream left are even more of a kind of that internecine warfare only got hotter. And
Yeah.
so I think the left has a real problem now because they don't know how to reconcile their coalition. They made much of their activist class being rabid. The
Yeah.
establishment is certainly trying to put the woke away, but I think that they're having a very, very difficult time doing it. I'm skeptical that long term they're going to have that option.
Yeah, one of the things I'm really actually concerned about is the fact that because the left went so insane culturally over the last decade, really, that a lot of like liberals are saying, the left left me, and
Mhm.
that I'm still holding the same positions, and that's cool and all. It's like, yeah, actually, the left is insane, anti-human, all that stuff. But what it's doing is it's liberalizing the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I'm actually concerned that they're shoring up some of the potential gain that the right could actually make to be more reactionary and actually take back some ground that we lost in the last half century, three quarters of a century. Do you ever get concerned about that because the left went so insane, you have a bunch of Scott Presslers in the Republican Party, and then we're more to the left than Barack Obama was in 2008?
I write a variation of this article like once a month, right? Yeah. The neocon cycle, and I come up with new and interesting names to warn people about this phenomenon
Yeah.
over and over again. But yeah, you're exactly right that this is the danger is that all of the Democrats just move over to the Republican
Mhm.
Party and take over. We've seen it before. We can see it unfolding now. The good news is I really feel like ultimately there is a serious pushback against it. And again, this is why the people who scream at us are screaming at us, because that's what
Yeah.
they want, right? Like that's
Yeah.
whether they'll never admit it to you, right? These guys, the squishy center Republicans will never admit it to you. But what they really are more comfortable with is the idea that a bunch of guys from the left kind of move over and take control, and that the IDW style folks are the ones driving the
Mhm.
bus. Like that's really what they would be comfortable with. That's the level. That's the John McCain, Mitt Romney level of Republican politics that they
Yeah.
really were
Mhm.
comfortable with. But there is a real desire for actual right wing belief under the surface, and they see it
Yeah.
and they hate it, and it makes
Mhm.
them scared and it makes them angry. But I think there's too much this time. And I'm a big
Mhm.
believer in elite theory. I think that elites can
Mhm.
shape the message and control the message. I think that ultimately, if these guys win and they control the apparatus long enough, they can set that tone. But I don't think they're going to win. I think if you look at the Trump administration, there are real right wingers in it this time.
Yeah.
Like there
Yeah.
are real right wingers.
Yeah.
I think the war within the Republican Party is more interesting than the Republican Democrat war at this point. The whole thing with Vivek and the H-1B conflict, and the fact that the right wing Twitter basically won it. That shows a lot of where the future of the fight needs to be held is the future of the Republican Party. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you see this in, more broadly in culture in general. Like, I mean, Auron has said, they're not really able to put the woke away. They really would like to, but they're not able to. At least, like within the Democratic Party, uh, they're not going to be allowed to. The radicals in their party are true believers in all of this stuff, and they will not tolerate any one of their politicians that does not toe the line on every single one of these things. So yeah, Gavin Newsom going on Charlie Kirk and saying, "Well, maybe I'm not so into the tranny stuff." Well, they freak out over that. So they're stuck, and they probably will be for the next decade in that internecine conflict. And it also parallels like the like pro Hamas segment of their party versus the pro establishment, pro Israeli segment. but you also see this in the culture. Like I made CJ watch the Super Bowl with me, only for
Trying to butch
only
him up there.
yeah, only like, and I'm like, just watch it for like cultural research reasons. Like you don't even have to enjoy it. And
I
the
didn't talk
thing,
to Andrew for a week after that.
yeah, he was mad at me. He was mad at me,
Sports balls.
but I mean, it actually it is worth watching this because the advertising and everything like that really gives you a window into how they intend on shaping the culture or how they react to cultural trends. And so there, you see like the next day people like, oh, it was the least woke Super Bowl in years, blah, 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 and it's like, well, actually, yeah, they didn't have like gay couples in every commercial or anything like that. But there was a very clear push at a level of like sentimentality, and very big push of like girl boss stuff. Like there was like that Nike commercial where the girl showed up all the boys and it was just obnoxious and cringe. But like you see that happening in the culture. Like you see the fact that Nancy Mace is like this huge Republican star, because she's standing up to the
For women,
tranny
yeah.
in Congress that wants to use the women's bathroom. And it's like, she is the one who played a major role in subverting the Citadel and opening it up to women, right?
Well,
is it-
isn't the consequences of my actions? Yeah.
yeah, like exactly. And it's just it's so comical that this just garish, obnoxious, vulgar woman is this icon now, right? I mean, she's so terrible, but like she's a star in the Republican Party now, and that's where they want things to be. They want it to be kind of the the feminism of the 90s and early 2000s, right? They want it to be situated there, right? That is very much where they want things culturally. But there's a growing segment of the right that is not satisfied with that, where like you see whenever she posts, like and she's like using Congress to like the floor of the house to like settle some kind of domestic dispute with an ex-boyfriend, and it's just disgusting stuff. And like you see whenever she posts, like she's getting ratioed, and it's not a bunch of lefties that are attacking her, it's people on the right. And so I think that like this can't, like this conflict is going to continue. Like this, they aren't just going to be able to seamlessly take over and bring things back and have this synthesis of the liberals burned by wokeness and leaving the Democratic Party and just merge them all together into this nice coalition. It's like, no, it's going to be on our terms, right? It's going to be, if you want to be part of this thing, like the Republican Party is going to pursue a pro-America, pro right-wing agenda. And you could be part of that if you want, or you can go back to the people that want to cut off the genitals of little boys. Like those are your options, right? And I think that those dynamics are going to continue to play out. Hopefully, I mean that's the white pill, that's the white pill version of it. But I could easily see a return also to give you some black pill hope here, that I can see a return where, yeah, the Nancy Maces and the Dan Crenshaws are the stars. They get propped up by the establishment conservative media.
I don't think that's possible.
No?
I think the neocon Dan, like the hoorah, like America's gonna fight for democracy is done.
Yeah,
I don't see any
I hope
future
so.
for that.
I hope so.
Let's get like Auron. I mean, do you have any? I don't want to take too much of your time, but like, do you have any thoughts on the future of the parties? I mean, like I was talking about the dynamics within the Republican Party. It's like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, like you live in Florida, DeSantis is your governor. He's got much more of a right wing, surrounding to him. Do you think that's more of the future of the Republican Party in the next decade?
Well, I'll say this: if you look at the responses, like someone like Dan Crenshaw puts out, even the conservative pundit class outside of like maybe Fox News is pretty against him in every
Mhm.
at every
Yeah.
level, right? Like even
Yeah.
people who are considered to be relatively mainstream conservative pundits are like, no, Crenshaw's a piece of trash, right? Like, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a big thing because look, let me say this, real quick. A lot of people, I think, get angry at the veneration of military service or something at this point, and I don't think that's correct. Like
Mhm.
I grew up on military bases. My family were military. A lot of my friends were military. I think that that should be something that is venerated no matter what,
Yeah.
and something that we should honor our lions, even if the tasks that they are asked to do by the government are not the things that we would approve of. That
Yeah.
they're acting out their lion spirit with honor, right? The
Yeah.
problem with Dan Crenshaw is that he very clearly used that as a shield to then push what is a very anti-American agenda. I mean, he
Mhm.
probably thinks it's American, but he
Yeah.
thinks that America is just its defense industry or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the case, right? So Dan Crenshaw is Mitch McConnell with an eye patch and a Navy SEAL badge, and those things mean something, right? Like
Mhm.
that sacrifice, that level of honor matters. But the fact that Crenshaw seems to have largely abandoned it so he could push, get rich and push a bunch of wars, he's being pretty regularly ratioed, not just on Twitter, but like by mainstream conservative pundits for that. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's a whole lot of travel in that for the Republican Party. Like,
Agreed.
sorry, but like, you're just never going to see. Sorry, what's the horrible neocon from South Carolina? What's her face?
Nikki
Lindsey
Haley.
Graham.
Thank you. Well, both. Yes, and um,
Okay.
but but the fact that like she was supposed to be the next big thing, and now no one
She
cares
works
about
for
her.
both.
Everybody hates, like she was supposed to be the next president, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very clear that Nikki Haley was supposed to be like, she's a
Mhm.
woman of color and she's strong on
Yeah,
defense and she's
If that
from the
bullet
South.
hit Trump, like
Huh?
if that bullet hit Trump in Butler, she
Right.
probably would be the president.
Right. Like that's
Yeah.
a very real thing that timeline existed. There was a possibility that we got stuck on the neocon track forever.
Yeah.
But I just think
Yeah.
that's dead. I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
died when that bullet missed. I think you're right to kind of draw that conclusion. And so I think ultimately, yeah, you're still gonna have Nancy Mace's in the party. Yes, there's still a lot of work to do. But I think ultimately the future is much more right wing. I think that
Mm.
DeSantis represents a local power base model that should be
Yeah.
copied by literally everyone. Any governor not copying that model, I think, should be suspect. Like, why aren't you
Yeah.
doing what you know works? Very specifically, what are your motives
Yeah.
for not doing that? And I think that Florida should absolutely abolish its term limits, so
Yeah.
DeSantis can just be the king of Florida. We don't have to do this really stupid. Oh, it's his wife. That's who we elected. Like,
Yeah, it's going to be
very
a
dumb.
Putin Medvedev
Right,
thing
right. Like
where-
this is very it is very dumb. Just
Yeah.
I would prefer the formalization of just making DeSantis king of Florida. He's obviously very good at what he does. Why not let him just be the best at it? And so I think that is ultimately what should be the future of the Republican Party. It won't be automatically. We're going to have to continue to fight for it. We're going to have to continue to push at whether it's
Yeah.
HB1B visas or it's infinite war in the Middle East. We're going to have to push back against it. But I do think that is the momentum that the Republican Party has.
All right, one last question from me, Auron. So one of the things that characterizes the total state is that there is this massive managerial bureaucracy. The 20th century is characterized basically by the managerialism of everything. So do you think our approach should be taking it over and wielding it for the benefit of heritage Americans and against our enemies? Or do you think the approach should much more be liquidate it, get it out of the way, and return to this bourgeois capitalism? Like what? And maybe it's both. Maybe it's a mixture of both. But like, how do you instinctually? Where do we go from here?
The answer is certainly both, right? You can't dismantle these things without controlling them. That's simply
Mhm.
all there is to it, right? You got to own the Department of Education before you can close it. That's just the way the government works.
Mhm.
That said, you're going to need a large amount of people who can manage those bureaucracies and turn them in your favor. However, the incentive structure there is to just keep them in place, to just keep using them oh, well, we'll just try to turn them for good. What you should quickly recognize, whether it's the Department of Education and every one of these public school teachers talking about how, Trump is evil Hitler, or whether it's FBI agents refusing to turn over key files and investigations, it should be clear that these things are rotten to the core. And so the best thing you can do with a lot of these institutions, the minute you own them, is just to shut them down. That there are a few that, like, you got to keep it operating military, guys. You got to get there are functions. We still need to make sure the trains run on time. Like, there are things that you need to be able to do to make the country function. But there are a lot of these bureaucracies like USAID and stuff we can just shut down, and no one will notice except their lives will get better. And so that's what we should be doing. We should be taking over the institutions that are necessary. Well, we need to take over all the institutions, but then we should manage the ones that are necessary entirely for the benefit of Americans. And we should shut down the ones that are unnecessarily as rapidly as possible. Again, use this as the reprieve, the moment to make space for these local and state regional organizations to flourish and prosper, while recognizing that ultimately power doesn't just disappear. And so you do have to control what is left, and you do have to wield it to the advantage of your political side.
Yeah, one of the best things I love about this is you can actually do a lot of things that the left is going to call, fascist and reactionary, or all these scary terms they'll come up with. But you can do all these things under the name of pursuing the Constitution. That's one of the beautiful things about our situation, is we can say, look, I'm just trying to, pursue the constitutional structure.
And you'll be right. You'll be right.
Yeah,
that Article 2 tells you that you have exactly the power that you're wielding. You're not even being deceptive. It's not even an argument. That it's just correct. It's the best thing. It is both politically advantageous and morally correct.
Yeah, it's like one of the best shields. You can eliminate 85% of the federal government in the name of constitutional freedoms, and there's nothing the left can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, they'll still call it, fascist.
But you can hide behind it. I mean, I love it. It's perfect.
You're not even hiding, though. You're like, you really are just doing.
I'm doing a noble eye thing, though.
Well, you're doing a revolution within the forums, but
backwards.
Yeah. I have one final question.
Yes,
I have one final question. So
I'll let you talk.
Maybe this is a softball. I don't know. Auron is a man of high culture, and
you can tell by the metal albums behind me, right?
That's exactly. Yeah. He's a man of high culture, and many of the young men that listen to this, they're trying to re-embrace their heritage and cultural roots. And so I think the perfect question to ask you, because I'm actually trying to do this. I grew up, just listening to country music mostly. So like top 5 metal albums that all of our listeners should listen to.
Ooh, top 5 metal albums. All right. So let's see. I would go.
Write these down.
We need. I'll start with my signature here. We need Striper. I think that Fallen is probably the best Striper album.
Okay.
You could go, if you want to go with doom metal, you could go with Psalm 9 by Trouble, who's directly behind me. That's another. They're somewhat Christian. They sang mostly about revelations in their doom metal. I would say that you probably need. Sorry, this is what happens when you put me on the spot. You need. Megadeth Rust in Peace is probably one of the greatest metal albums ever pressed. I would say Black Sabbath Heaven and Hell is one of my favorite metal albums of all time. And I would say probably Metallica, Ride the Lightning would be my personal favorite for best Metallica album, though people will debate between that and Master of Puppets, maybe A Justice for All.
Andy's writing this down.
Okay.
He's doing the homework. He's not just inviting you on. He wants to know.
I must have this knowledge. So excellent. Well, that's all I got. Successful interview.
That was like the whole reason he had you on.
just to lead to this moment. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm doing cultural work.
I respect your dedication to the arts. You're a man of high culture. Absolutely.
Precisely. Yeah.
Wow. That's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Auron, so much. Everyone should
go buy the book.
Go buy book right now. Stop what you're doing and buy this book right here. The Total State. It's a great great read. And it's fun. Like I like read it, in your voice, in every sense of the term, it's great. I mean, it very easy to read too. Like you're very good at communicating.
Yep.
And so please go buy the book, and thank you again, Auron, for joining us here today.
Thanks again for having me, guys.